Does God really care for the hurting? I believe most of us here would say absolutely yes. There are many in this world who would say either no or I don't know. And if you're visiting with us, or if maybe you've been visiting for a long time, and you really don't know if God cares, I hope by the end of this lesson there'll at least be some things that you can think about that would say, oh yes, he cares. I know he cares. His heart is touched with my grief. Thank you for being here this morning. We're going to study Exodus chapter 3, verses 6 through 8. And so if you have a Bible, you might want to open to that text. As we think about the three possible answers to that question, does God really care? Yes, no, I don't know. We see the effects of how we answer that question in everyday life. Christopher Hitchens in 2010, a famous atheist who debated many theists, as he had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer, terminal, said, to the dumb question, why me, the cosmos barely bothers to return the reply, why not? I'm here as a product of the process of evolution, which doesn't make very many exceptions, and which rates life relatively cheaply. I mean, most human beings who've ever been born would have been dead long before they reach my age, and I would think in most of the rest of the world, well, I know it is still true. So to be relatively healthy at 62 is to be dealt a pretty good hand by the cosmos, which doesn't know I'm here and won't notice when I'm gone. So that seemed the only properly stoic attitude to take. That's one way to look at pain and suffering. On maybe a similar trajectory, David Hume, talking about suffering, said, Epicurus' old questions are yet unanswered. Is he, talking about God, willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? But as we have sung this morning, does Jesus care? Oh yes, he cares. I know he cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are weary, the long nights dreary, I know my Savior cares. There are going to be different ways we approach suffering depending on how we look at God and suffering. If there is no God, then why not? If there is a God, we might ask why. But if there is a God who is all powerful, all knowing, and all loving, then I think we can at least say there is a reason that he has not yet taken away suffering. Or this is why he is dealing with my suffering the way he is, or this is how I can deal with suffering in view of that. But as we sing a song like, Does Jesus Care? We affirm, oh yes, he cares, but we haven't really answered the question, how do we know that God really cares? And that's why I want us to look at Exodus chapter 3 this morning. Because we're going to see three proofs that say, if God, then this is why we know he cares. And I'm actually going to be using Exodus 3 because Stephen and I try to preach through each book of the Bible at least once a month, and we are coming to Exodus this month. But I also see this as pointing directly to Jesus in answering this question. And so I want us to tie Exodus 3 to the life of Jesus and to see why we know God cares, not only from his interaction with the Israelites, but his interaction with the world in Jesus Christ, and particularly with his people. So if you would, turn to Exodus chapter 3, and we're going to take each verse in verses 6 through 8 and work our way through them. First text is Exodus chapter 3 and verse 6. He said, also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. When we read this text and ask the question, does God really care for the hurting? We keep in mind the context in which God is appearing to Moses. His people, the Israelites, are in bondage in Israel. People are suffering. People are dying. And he says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This is proof number one that God cares for people because he identifies himself with people. God doesn't have to do that. He is the God over all and above all, and yet what does he do? He says, I am the God of your father. Your translations may say the God of your fathers, but the God of your father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He chooses to self-identify with people, to look back in the history of Israel and say, this is the God that I am. And that phrase, I am, is going to become more significant as we jump into chapter 6 in just a moment. But he says, who am I? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now I want us to remember the context in which he is saying this, not only the broad context of Israel being in Egypt, but also Moses in Midian. And if we look in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, here's what we find. Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of the bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. That's when he says, and he said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, there is a holiness about God. Holiness implies separation. There's a twofold holiness of God. Number one, just by his essence, he is above and beyond. He is separate from us. There is a sense in which we cannot become holy like God is holy in that sense. There's another sense in which we can become holy as God is holy, in his moral holiness. But I want to suggest here that whichever of those two categories it is, he is saying, Moses, you cannot approach me because this is holy ground. Because wherever God is holy. As J.R. Bronger would say, there was nothing special about the dirt on that side of the mountain versus the dirt on the other side of the mountain. It's where God is. It's because he is a holy God. And he says, you cannot approach me because of my holiness. But what does he turn around and say? Yes, there is distance. There is a holiness separation. But he says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. You see, then he appeals to his faithfulness. So the character of God is one of holiness, but it is also one of faithfulness. And he is showing Moses there is a means by which we can bridge the gap of this separation. What do people often do when they are in times of travail, times of sorrow? They say, God has abandoned me. He says, yes, there is separation, but God identifies with his promises, with his people. And that's what he means when he says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He says, I am the God who keeps the promises that I have made to my people. Look in chapter 2, Exodus chapter 2. In the narrative section in verses 23 through 25, it says, Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. You see, when God saw his people who were hurting, he remembered Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What's that mean? He is a God of covenant faithfulness. This is the I am who I am, he says of himself in chapter 6. This is a God who understands covenant fidelity. And when his people are hurting, he remembers his covenant. Look in chapter 6, verses 2 through 8. Exodus chapter 6, verses 2 through 8. God spoke further to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. Your translation may say Yahweh. I am Yahweh. And I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, Lord, or I am, he is, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourned. Furthermore, I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. I want that emphasis of chapters 2, 3, and 6 to resonate in our minds, that when God says, this is who I am, he says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the God who connects with people, and he connects with people through covenant. And so where holiness, and especially in view of sin, causes a separation between us and God, God says, I am a faithful God who draws himself to us. God remembered his covenant. And I think that's what we see when Jesus comes in and provides the ultimate fulfillment of this promise of connection. Because when we look at Jesus, we see God remembering his covenant with the fathers. In Luke chapter 1, we find a song, a poem, if you will, of Mary, sometimes called the Magnificat. I think they pronounce it differently if you're in England, but we'll go Magnificat. In Luke chapter 1, it says in verses 46 through 55, and Mary said, my soul exalts the Lord, and my spirit has rejoiced in God my Savior, for he has had regard for the humble state of his bondslave. For behold, from this time on, all generations will count me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name, and his mercy is upon generation after generation toward those who fear him. He has done mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in the thoughts of their heart. He has brought down rulers from their thrones. He has exalted those who were humble. He has filled the hungry with good things. He sent away the rich empty-handed. He has given help to Israel, his servant, in remembrance of his mercy, or his loving kindness, if we were to use Old Testament language, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham and his descendants forever. When Mary looks at what God is doing through her and bringing Jesus into this world, he says, that is remembrance of chesed, of loving kindness that we talked about last week. This is God remembering Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see, what we see in foretaste of God remembering Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the covenant he made with them, in remembering his people, hearing their groaning, he is brought to fullness when we get to the incarnation of Jesus Christ. When he came into this world, this is the ultimate remembrance of the covenant. So for the people who are in humble state, not just humble morally, but also humble in their standing, that they have been brought low by their faithfulness to God, he says God is going to exalt. He's going to raise up his people. Why? Because he is a God who connects with his people. Zechariah says something very similar in just a few verses later in 67 through 79. And then in Hebrews chapter 2, we find that Jesus again connects with people, with those who are in fear of death all their lives. He is made like his brethren. He participates with them. He experiences the same things that they do. And what is he able to do? He uses two words. He's able to offer help. He's able to offer aid. Those who are caught in the anxiety and fear of death because of the power of Satan, Jesus has come into this world to connect, to be made like his brethren, and to bring them up. Furthermore, I think we see pictures of this even in the life of Jesus, where he is showing where he is going to connect with those who are hurting yet who come to him for healing. In Mark chapter 2, the story of the leper, Jesus didn't have to do this, but it visually shows his connection with this man. He reaches out and touches the leper. Says, I am willing, be cleansed. Or you have the story of the thief on the cross in Luke chapter 23. And what does he say? Remember me when you come into your kingdom. It says, today you will be with me in paradise. See, that is the most striking picture of someone dying with Jesus, suffering with Jesus, but asking him to remember. And Jesus says, paradise is the end. In the Exodus and in the incarnation and the crucifixion, we see God has come down to his people, and he is connecting, associating with them. The question then is, are we connecting with God? Does God really care for those who are hurting? Well, proof number one is that his very identity, who he is. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. I am the God of covenant. I am the God who connects with people, proves that he does indeed care. But if we move on to verse number 7, we find this. And Yahweh said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sufferings. Does God really care for the hurting? Yes, because he sees, hears, and knows their pain. He sees, hears, and knows their pain. Did you notice those three verbs there? I have surely seen, I have heard, I know. This speaks to the omniscience of God. And I suggest that the omniscience of God is not just something that is kind of ethereal, that this is a power that he has, but this is a means of involvement with his people. When he says, I see, I hear, I know, he is again building on not only identity of connecting himself, identifying himself with people, but he's saying in his actions, in his knowledge, he is showing that he knows his people. So he is with his people and he knows his people. There is some emphatic language being used in verse number 7. Your translation probably says something along the lines of, I have surely seen, or I have indeed seen. That's an exclamation point in Hebrew. It's using a construction actually known as an infinitive absolute construction. But you may have heard, seeing I have seen is kind of a very wooden way of translating that. It's the same construction is used back in Genesis chapters 2 and 3, where it says, you will surely die, or dying you will die. It's an emphatic point to say this is really going to happen. And when he uses this construction here in verse 7, he's saying, you can be absolutely sure I have seen. There's no doubt about it. God is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Therefore, he is the God who has seen the affliction of his people. But not only do we have that construction, but we also have a structure here in verse number 7, in which we might call it an envelope structure or a chiasm. It's where you start on one end, you come down to a middle, and then you come back up in reverse order. And we have something similar to something like that happening in verse number 7. He says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and their cry for help I have heard. And so you have on either side the verbs, I have seen, I have heard. What do you have right in the middle? What he wants to point to. I have seen their afflictions, and their cry I have heard. It's not just that God has this general sense of I see, I hear, but he sees the affliction. He hears the cry. You think about, for those who are parents, when you see the pain and you hear the cry of your children, your eye, your ear goes directly to what is the problem. You see the issue. And even in the structure of this verse, he's centering in on the affliction, he's centering in on the cry. God is a God who sees and a God who hears these things that are happening to his people. In verse number 9, he repeats it again for emphasis. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 9. He says, "Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them." Notice here at the end of verse 9, he is again emphasizing what is happening to the Israelites. You have that kind of double repetitive nature there, the oppression with which they are being oppressed. He's putting exclamation points all the way through to say, I see it, I hear it, I know it, and this is what it is. God doesn't pretend like it's not there. He doesn't pretend like the servants are not, the sons of Israel are not going through oppression, affliction, and crying out for help, groaning under their burdens. But he says, I want you to know, I see it, I hear it, I know it. For those who are not Christians, you may look at that and say, if there is a God, and he sees, hears, and knows, why is he not doing? And the point of this story is, if God sees, hears, and knows, he is doing something. It may not be something we can see right now. It may not be on our timetable, but it's not like he's whitewashing a bad situation. He calls it what it is. It is affliction. It is a cry for help. It is suffering. It is oppression. But he is doing something. For God, seeing, hearing, knowing is not just something he puts into his library, the library in his mind. This is a call for action. And he is going to act. As we think through the picture of a God who sees, a God who hears, a God who knows, I think when Moses would have come to them and told them this, they would have remembered the stories of their forefathers. That God is the God who sees and has heard the cry of Hagar. That God is the one who sees that Leah is unloved and he hears her prayer and he gives her children. That he is the God of Hannah who answers her prayer in her distress. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, that's, as far as I can tell, the only other place where this exact construction, I have surely seen, or surely see, is used, where she puts it into the prayer, if you will indeed see, then do this, and I will do this. You see, she understood that if God indeed sees something, here is my response. I will vow whatever I need to vow to him, because he knows my affliction. He knows my suffering. We're going to come back to that last phrase in Exodus chapter 3 in just a moment. For I know their sufferings. Because I think this is a direct connection to Jesus. You see, Jesus is trying to prove to us that he is a God who knows. He's a God who sees, who hears, and knows. Why? Because he is a God who has experienced the very things that we experience. He saw affliction. He delivered outcries, groanings. He suffered as a man of sorrows. In Hebrews chapter 4, we find the application that the writer of Hebrews makes for Jesus, seeing, hearing, and knowing what we have gone through. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who is tempted in all points as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. He says, we have a sympathetic priest. He has gone what we have gone through, and he has proven that he is a God who sees, hears, and knows. He sympathizes, and has compassion for his people. Again, pictures of Jesus connecting with people in this way that he sees, hears, and knows through his experience are shown in Matthew chapter 9, where he had compassion on the people, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. And what does he do? He says, pray that God will send out laborers. In chapter 14, he had compassion on the people, so he taught them many things. In chapter 15, he had compassion on the people, and so he fed them in their time of need. And yet I think one of the most touching pictures of a sympathetic Jesus is in John chapter 11. Well, let's turn there, please. John chapter 11. Before they even made the trek to the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, Jesus knew exactly what was happening and what would happen. And he purposefully delayed. There's a sense in which the same thing happened in Exodus. God allowed his people to be enslaved. He sent to deliver, they rejected him, and so there was another 40 years of waiting. And then instead of coming in and destroying the enemies outright, he sent 10 plagues, which caused great difficulty, at least at the start, for the people of God. We see something similar happening in John chapter 11. If you would read with me verses 30 through 37. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village and was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary had got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Let me pause there for just a moment. When it says Jesus wept, and it says that he was moved in spirit and troubled, I've read some commentaries that suggest this is that he became angry. I want to suggest that what we read in verse 36 shows that this does not seem to be just a angry, vicious God among people at this moment. Verse 36, it says, So the Jews were saying, see how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying? Jesus came among friends who have lost a loved one, and he is touched by their grief. He weeps, and they know he loves. See, God is a God. Jesus is a God who sympathizes and connects with his creation in real and meaningful ways. And the ultimate picture of this is his self-sacrifice on the cross. Having looked at Isaiah 53 this morning, I just want to allude to verses 1 through 12, because back in Exodus chapter 3, where it says, I know their sufferings, that word sufferings is not super common in the Old Testament, but it's the very word that is used twice in Isaiah 53. He is a man of sorrows, and he bears our sorrows. You see, if God knows his people's suffering, sorrows, same word in Hebrew, he is also the one who comes in and bears the sorrows of his people. He carries their sorrows. And so when we read in 1 Peter chapter 5 that prayer is the means by which we can be freed at least somewhat of the bond of anxiety, it's because he cares for us. He is able to shoulder our sorrows, and he has proven that on the cross. The man of sorrows, the man of sufferings, has shown that he can take our sufferings and take our sorrows. And the question is, does Jesus care? Oh, yes, he cares. How do I know? Because he became a man of sorrows for his people who were suffering. And even though we had rejected him, he accepts us by means of that sacrifice. Does God really care? Well, proof number 2 is that if he knows, we know he cares. We're not distant. We don't have to just try to gain his attention, as we talked about with the prophets of Baal. His heart is already touched by our grief, and he proved that on the cross. Which brings us to our third point in verse number 8. As God continues this promise to Moses, he says, "So I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite." And again, he says in verse 9, because the cry has come. You see, God says he cares, not only because of who he is and what he knows, but also because of what he does. He comes down to bring them up. He comes down to bring them up. And I think this is the climactic statement of the promise in verses 6 through 8. I have come down to bring them up. Now, we actually have 2 statements that are made, 2 purpose statements in the coming down language. I have come down to deliver, to rescue, and to bring them up. Now, I would just note that when God says he comes down, that is hope for God's people, but that is disaster for the enemies of God. Here he is coming down. Why? So that he can bring judgment upon the Egyptians. They should have heard ringing in their ears the tradition that they had been hearing, the stories they had heard of the Tower of Babel. He came down and confused their languages. They should have heard the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. I have come down to see, and I will know if it is. He destroyed those cities. And now he's come down to Egypt. But on the positive side of the judgment is that God has come down for his people. Yes, it will lead to the disaster of the Egyptians. Why? Because they are the ones who are oppressing. He's to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians, from the power of the Egyptians. Why? Because God's hand is more powerful than Pharaoh's. And that is a theme that traverses the rest of the first half of Exodus, is I'm going to empower Pharaoh by giving him a command he does not want to obey, and with his strong hand, he's going to send you out. But it's because of my strong hand that is bringing judgment on him. And so God is showing, I am coming down for a purpose, and that is to bring my people out from the hand of the Egyptians. I'm going to rescue them. He's heard their cry, and he is going to deliver. When God descends, he delivers. And when you look at that language of deliverance in the form of bringing up out of that land, that word, bring up, if you're in the adult class, we talked about the burnt offering. We talked about how that word for burnt offering is an ascending, like going up. This is the same verb, root of that word for burnt offering. It means to come up. In this specific form, in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 8, it is, I have come down to cause them to go up. Or, maybe we could translate this way, to cause them to arise. You see, what we have in Exodus chapter 3 is resurrection language in deliverance. Now, I'm not saying he specifically is saying, I'm going to raise you from the dead. But he says, I am going to cause you to rise out of the land of Egypt, and I'm going to bring you to what? The promised land, the very land that I promised to the patriarchs, because I remember my covenant. You see, deliverance for the Israelites was an ascension out of the land of Egypt. We find this same verb, and in fact the same form, it's a Hiphil form, in Exodus chapter 37. In Exodus chapter 37, look at how this language of to cause to go up is being used. Ezekiel chapter 37. It says in verse 11, "Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up and our hope has perished. We are completely cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will open your graves and cause you to come out. I will bring you out. I will cause you to come out, cause you to arise from your graves, my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. Then you will know that I am the Lord. I am Yahweh. When I have opened your graves and caused you to come up out of your graves, my people, I will put my spirit within you, and you will come to life, and I will place you on your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken and done it, declares the Lord." That sounds an awful lot like the Exodus. Why? Because Ezekiel is giving us a new Exodus. And what does new Exodus look like? In this vision, it looks like coming to life and coming into the promised land. That's what it was in Exodus. That's what it was for Ezekiel. And I want to suggest that same promise, that same hope, in answer to the question, does God care? Is that yes, because resurrection proves he cares. Because after resurrection comes promised land, out of slavery, out of death, into life, into resurrection, into an eternal abode, the promised land of God. When we come to Jesus, we see this pictured for us. In John chapter 11, again, John chapter 11, just after this, he is going to show his sympathy, his direct connection to them. But look at how he identifies himself before that, the cause of faith in him. John chapter 11, verses 25 through 27, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, or he who entrusts himself to me, will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe that? Jesus says to Martha. I want to ask us, when we look at either our own suffering or the rest of the suffering in this world, when we see Jesus come down, descend to deliver his people, and the promise of resurrection sealed and signed, if you will, by his own resurrection, do we believe that? Because resurrection is the proof that God cares. We may be in suffering right now, but life from the dead is yet future. Now, I'm not saying that God does not, in his providence, deliver us in very real ways today. He did miraculously for the people of Israel in Exodus chapter 3. But I want to suggest that that's just a small picture. And even if we don't get a specific deliverance of whatever is causing us sorrow right now, God has already said, resurrection day is coming. And if resurrection is coming, that means these are momentary light afflictions. Suffering is what causes us to cry out to God. And our cries to God have caused him to descend so that he can cause us to ascend. In Mark chapter 12, as Jesus is dealing with the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection from the dead, is it not interesting that the text he chooses is a text that says, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And if you fill in the rest of that text, now you have this God is the God of the living. Because he has seen, he has heard, he knows the affliction of his people, the power of death in their life. And he has come down to rescue them. And in Jesus coming down, dying, being buried, and being raised, We have proof from Exodus 3 and from Matthew 28 or Mark 16 or Luke 24 or John 20 that God is going to bring his people up. See, for anyone who says there is no resurrection, there is no hope. But Jesus has proven that there is resurrection. And God pointed to resurrection way back in Exodus chapter 3. Not only by saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but by saying, I have come down that I might bring my people out of that land. And God is going to deliver on his promises. Over and over again, he has proven himself faithful. And so what God does in the promise of resurrection and in his descent, his condescension, incarnation, to deliver us, rescue us, is proof that he does indeed care. Now, I want us to understand, as we've already alluded to, that in this story we also find that deliverance does not necessarily mean immediate deliverance, and it does not always mean deliverance the way we anticipate it happening. Because if we keep on reading through Exodus chapter 3 on into 4, 5, 6, and following, what we find is that it's an extended time. We find that it brings difficulty aligning themselves with God himself. It ends in judgment. But throughout all of that is the hope of Exodus chapter 3. This is who God is. This is what he knows. And this is what he will do. And if Jesus really came to this world, which he did, and he really died on the cross to connect with our suffering and bear our sorrows, then he is ultimately, like himself, going to cause us to arise. And that is the hope. On God's timetable, in God's way, he is going to deliver his people. Because this is who he is, and this is what he does. Now I want to say, as we bring our lesson to a close, that if God has proven that he is a God who cares, he is going to bring us into this act of caring and expect us to apply his character and his action in our own life. Not only that we become recipients of his rescue, his deliverance, but that we become the participants in that. Because in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 10, it says, therefore come now, I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. You see, how is God going to accomplish deliverance? It's through a man like Moses. And it may be that we're looking at this and saying, I'm hurting, God, just take away the pain. And he says, I'm sending you a comforter. I'm sending you a deliverer. It may be that we need to be that comforter and that deliverer for the present until resurrection day comes. Now, will we step up and participate in this resurrection goal of God, of bringing them to him? Or will we be like Moses and say, this isn't for me. I can't do this. No one's going to listen. What if they say, who is this person? That's when we must change the way we handle these things. If we are going to participate in God helping the hurting, even for our own hurts and our own redemption from death, then we need to participate in that with others, for others. So I would say that is part of that participation in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus that not only happens at baptism, but continues to occur in our everyday lives. As we look at not only our own suffering, but also the suffering of others, I would point us to two final quotes here. Philip Yancey said, if Jesus were a mere man, his death would prove God's cruelty. The fact that he was God's son proves instead that God fully identifies with suffering humanity. Thus, the cross, stumbling block to some, became the cornerstone of Christian faith. Any discussion of how pain and suffering fit into God's scheme ultimately leads back to the cross. And C.S. Lewis, When pain is to be borne, a little courage helps more than much knowledge, a little human sympathy more than much courage, and the least tincture of the love of God more than all. Ultimately, it is by bringing people to the love of God that we can receive help, endurance, aid, maybe even full relief from suffering. But we must be the vehicle, like Moses was the vehicle. He comforts us in our distress so that we might bring comfort to others. And this is not just a sermon saying, be kind and make others feel good. This is a resurrection goal. Will we cause people to rise to God? And if we will, God can use us to show that he cares. Does God care? Who he is, what he knows, what he does, and how he uses us proves that he does indeed care. So we can hold on to that promise this week in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, that in all things God works for good to those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Will we step into that purpose and be part of the power of the resurrection in our own lives and in the lives of others? The gospel is God coming down to raise us up. Have you been buried with Christ and raised with Christ in hope that one day you'll receive redemption of the body? That is the ultimate hope in the midst of a world of suffering and death. And God cares for you. If you need to come to the Lord this morning, why don't you come to the front as we stand and as we sing.